Okay, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. This is a very, very important issue that has much bipartisan support here in Minnesota and in Washington, D.C. So today we're here to talk about good governance. We're not here to beat up on the Met Council. We're not here to beat up on even the decisions they have made in the past or might make in the future. This is about getting our regional government in compliance with what every other MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, in the country is in compliance with. Now, some of you know I authored an amendment to statutorily get this done by removing the clause that's been grandfathered for our Met Council. But since 1991, you should know that federal laws required MPOs around the country to have local elected officials on their board. In 2012, Congress passed MAP 21, which included a clause stating that these MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, need to come in compliance with this requirement for accountability. And they would have a transition period of up to 2 years. A number of MPOs did just that. There was no chaos. It worked out just fine. They came into compliance. They didn't lose federal funding. Right now, our MPO, the Met Council, is the only one that doesn't comply. I was debating a member from the other side of the aisle on Thursday night when this amendment passed, unanimously I might add, in Washington. And I said, Representative, all we're arguing for in Minnesota is what your MPO already complies with. And that's one of the reasons I think it passed unanimously. We now have the only board in the country that is entirely non-elected, making crucial decisions on transportation, on housing, on infrastructure, without any accountability from the people it's supposed to represent. That's why this is about good governance. It's not about this council or this model. Well, it is about this model, to be perfectly honest. It's not a good model. It needs to come in compliance. We have the only MPO in the country that can raise taxes independently and yet does not have elected members on its board. We have the only MPO in the country whose budget dwarfs all others in our nation. Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Seattle, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, Denver, Miami, Tampa, and Chicago. None of them is as large as our Met Council. So why is it that we don't have some form of accountability? Now, my amendment would merely remove the grandfathered clause in there, going back to 1991, that I think has been misinterpreted, and would force us to start the process that these good folks behind me have been working on for quite some time. It does not mandate at the federal level any sort of reform, any sort of particular model. It'd be up to the local folks to come up with a form that represents people and gives them accountability. To those who say this is federal meddling, that's a good one. You've got a council that gets money from where? The federal government. Southwest Light Rail Line is going to get $960 million. If they really want the federal government to get out, the federal government can take their $960 million and go home. Would that be non-federal meddling? Now, they want the federal meddling, but they don't want accountability. And that's all this is. It is not a reflection on any member of the Met Council, not a reflection on any governor. It's not a reflection, as I say, even on the decisions that have been made, some of which I disagree with, some of which I agree with. It's a reflection on what good governance looks like. And right now we don't have it. And that's why I authored this amendment in the United States Congress. That's why I believe it passed unanimously. It wasn't even a recorded yeas and nays. That's why it's now part of the FAA reauthorization bill that's now going to the Senate. And that's why come September we need to get that done, and this needs to be a part of it. So I wanted to lay the groundwork for what we're trying to do, why I think it's important, and then turn it over to these esteemed folks behind me to let them talk a little bit about the legislation they've been working on here in St. Paul. So I'm Representative Jason Lewis, and that'll do it for now for me. Eric?
Well, thank you. My name is Senator Eric Pratt, and I represent Senate District 55, which really is most of Scott County. Not too long ago, I took over the chairmanship of the Legislative Commission on Metropolitan Governments, which has limited oversight on the Metropolitan Council's operations, but also makes recommendations back to the legislature. Now, earlier this year, we took testimony from Minnesota residents, or Metro residents and Minnesota businesses that effectively said that the Met Council wasn't representing their interests. It's effectively become an offshoot of the executive branch, rather than representing the residents and citizens of the metropolitan area. Now, it doesn't matter whether the governor is Republican, Democrat, or independent. Metropolitan governments and structure has been an issue that we've been dealing with for decades. So despite our differences, we have bipartisan support for reform in the form of Senate File 2809. And I believe this is a measured attempt for us to restructure the Metropolitan Council. It would conform with federal law, as Jason said, by creating a council of governments. Now, this is also one of the recommendations that came out of the nonpartisan Office of Legislative Auditors recommendations. And my hope is that it will reduce partisanship with staggered terms and by making sure that we have local elected officials running the council. And I'm proud to be working with my co-authors, Senator Hall, Hoffman, Newton, and Jensen on this effort. And I hope Congressman Lewis's efforts in Washington will be the catalyst we need for change here in Minnesota. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a time when Tony Albright has an opportunity to give you a little history lesson. So this initiative I have been working on for now 4 years. And as a history lesson, I mentioned this to my father-in-law the first time that I introduced the bill about 4 years ago over Easter. And he said, you know, I was one of the co-authors on the bill that started the Met Council. So for those of you who know Paul Overgaard from the Albert Lea area, his son-in-law is going to rectify that which was put into law back in the 1970s. So that being said, the most important feature that I would talk to you about with this bill is that we have an agency of unelected appointees that have a levying authority, taxation authority, and a budget that dwarfs, as Congressman Lewis has said, any number of other major metropolitan areas. And they report to a constituency of 1. This is not about a disparagement of anyone that's on the council, but governance does need transparency. It also needs accountability. I thank you for all for coming, and I think there's some others that would like to say some words.
Thank you for coming. Senator Scott Jensen from District 47. I would simply say that this piece of legislation is the fruit of a lot of efforts made along the way, and I don't think this is a destination. This is just a step along the way. I think there has to be more to come. Elected officials will enhance accountability, and that's what we need to do, because in the end result, what that will mean is there'll be increased transparency, so people who are being governed by the Met Council decisions will have at least an opportunity to know why, how, and who can they go to. Thanks for coming.
Well, I'm Senator Jerry Newton. I've been working for years trying to get a mid-council where we have staggered terms for the members of the council. As it is now, as you know, when we get a new governor in, especially he's from a different party, you're going to have an entirely new council that comes on board. What that means is that the staff at mid-council is the ones that actually run the council for a while, because you've got people that are not familiar with the process. They don't know all of the aspects of what the council does. I think this bill is still has some way to go. We have some, it's not perfect, but it's a move in the right direction, and I really encourage my fellow Democrats, it might be only John Hoffman, but to support this bill. Thank you.
I love it when Jerry Newton calls me out. You know, that reminds me of a story. Talk about a history lesson, Tony. And when I was inoculated onto the Elk-Hennepin School Board, Jerry Newton was kind of the mentor there that was there, and he and Jim Abler used to tell some really good stories, so it's nice to get called on that. But I said, I'll put aside, my wife said I'm not funny, don't try to be funny, but in all sincerity, this is something that, no matter where you are in the spectrum of life in this beautiful city of ours, what's the one thing you always hear from city officials is complaining about either they love or they hate the Met Council. Well, this is not about the Met Council, this is about a process, and let's just be consistent with where we are. federally and where we know it's right, because if we want to truly get transparency and some bipartisan look at things, and it's no longer about who's in control of the situation, because every 4 years or every 8 years, you get a new governor that comes in and they get to pick whoever they want. Either you're for light rail or you're against light rail, but now this time, we're hoping to get a balance to that, and I think the only way to truly do that is what Senator Pratt is saying, which is a true bipartisan look at that. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Senator Pratt, and thank you, Jason Lewis, for being here as well. So, Commissioners?
Well, thank you again for being here. There's not enough room up here for all the city folks that wanted to be here. We have a number of 40 municipalities around the metro that have signed on to the principles supporting Met Council reform. I'm not going to repeat everything they've said. This isn't about our governor. This is not about Tim Pawlenty, the previous governor, or maybe the next governor. This is about the governance of the Met Council. The Met Council has under its purview the Transportation Advisory Board, perhaps one of the higher functioning boards in the state. I contend that's because it's made up of a majority of elected officials. That Transportation Advisory Board, however, does not have the authority to appropriate the $150 million dished out from the federal government back to Minnesota. That can only be done by the Metropolitan Council, which is the designated metropolitan planning organization. Our TAB, however, can make a recommendation to the Metropolitan Council, and that's just what it does. But the Metropolitan Council holds the authority to not take that advisory and to not fund those dollars, or send it back to the Transportation Advisory Board and the Technical Council to reassess their decision and come back with something that the Met Council might like. I contend that's a failed process. If we had the TAB as our Metropolitan Council, we'd have a model that worked. We would have elected officials making decisions. We would have taxation with representation instead of taxation without the representation we currently have. Thank you for being here. And again, I wish our city friends could be here. We have many, many more colleagues from the counties that would all be here. And thank you again.
Good afternoon, thanks for being here. I'm Mike Beard. I've worn a couple hats in this Met Council discussion over the last few years. As chair of the Transportation Committee, as a member of the House for a dozen years, I was chair for 2. But I was involved with the Metropolitan Council with transit issues and with metropolitan highway issues for many years, trying to deal with someone who had a constituency of 1. So oftentimes I thought, why not just talk to the governor, whether it was my friend Tim Pawlenty or my neighbor Mark Dayton. But instead I had to go through the Met Council process, so I've got that experience as well. I was there when we asked the legislative auditor to please look at governance in the Twin Cities, transit governance in the Twin Cities, because we were having so much contention with what seemed to be a one-size-fits-all, top-down kind of fit for transit. And those of us that lived in the hinterlands out in the suburbs were chafing under that. We asked the legislative auditor to look at it, and he came out with his 2011 report saying, we can talk about transit all we want, and in spite of the misfits and the misstarts, it works amazingly well. But folks, the real problem you need to deal with is the governance of the Metropolitan Council itself. That's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Deal with that, and you'll fix your fits and starts with your transit issues. We could talk for an hour on that topic alone. I left the legislature. I'm now a county commissioner from Scott County. Glad to be there, still playing a major role in regional transportation governance and dealing once again as a county official with the Metropolitan Council. As county official, I think we need to have a role in Metropolitan Council governance. We need to have a county official from each county in the metropolitan area on the Metropolitan Council Governing Board. I think the cities should make up the other 16 districts. Now, how we actually end up with that in the end is debatable, but my contention is if we fix the governance issue, all the other concerns about the Metropolitan Council, policies, issues, reach, things like that, they'll take care of themselves because they'll be accountable to a much broader constituency, a constituency of almost 3 million people, instead of a constituency of 1. We also, as county officials, many of us wear the same a hat that interfaces with the Metropolitan Council in land use, planning, use, zoning, and issues like that. Scott County, we actually oversee the land use issues for all of our townships. Several of the counties do. As such, we're up close and personal with the Met Council all the time. and yet we're almost treated as county officials as an afterthought. It's like the cities, the 180-some cities in the 7 counties are the primary focus of the staff at the Met Council. This bill will aim to fix that governance issue as well. I think that the bill that Senator Pratt and Representative Albright have carried and has garnered bipartisan support is an enormous step in the right direction. Speaking for all my colleagues, at least in the 4 counties that have stayed the fight for the last 10 years, we want to say thank you to Congressman Lewis for giving us a hand in Washington and helping to push the issue so we can get this issue front and center, have the discussion, hopefully in the conference committee, and find a bill the governor can sign, and we can actually accomplish what Jim Noble asked us to do back in February of 2011, when he said you need to solve the governance issue with the Met Council. I think that sums it up pretty succinctly. We're ready to stand for any questions you might have and encourage some good coverage of a very important topic for the metropolitan area.
Congressman Lewis, can you game out a little bit where this goes moving forward? I know the Senate still has to look at its FAA reauthorization bill. First of all, I don't know if you've heard from Klobuchar or Senator Smith on their support or opposition, but assuming that they support the governor's position, and I don't know the answer to that, how does this move forward?
Well, I can tell you, about 5 minutes after we went to the Rules Committee and got our amendment out to the floor, we heard from a lot of people, but it wasn't the 2 senators. We've got to reauthorize FAA by the end of September. Right now, it's been an unsustainable process of reauthorization without new legislation, and so we're trying to get that done. It does go to the Senate now. They have their own bill. They'll have to be obviously merged. But I do believe that there's a powerful advantage in being right. And the fact of the matter is, every other MPO in the country has already adopted or made this transition. Why we are still the last holdout, it's a very, very untenable position to defend. And so I think if these folks, as well as the citizens who are being governed by this unelected body, make their voices heard, I expect it will survive the Senate. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do.
You guys all represent equal-sized districts, or you all represent equal-sized populations in your bodies. Does this reorganization do the same thing, or would, like Ramsey County, have the same voice as Scott County or Dakota County? Would they all be, would it be proportional population? That's what I'm asking.
In a sense, if you think about the founding of the country and the discussion between big states, small states, and equal representation, we've had that discussion amongst ourselves in a microcosm, John. We think because the counties have so much interface with the Metropolitan Council, that each county should have 1 commissioner. Now that is up for debate. We could probably flex on that. But the cities, in the model that we're contemplating, will follow the equal representation model that exists right now with 16 commissioner districts that are balanced for population. And we anticipate, or we're suggesting, that the cities pick from among those districts so they have equal representation, but that also an equal voice on the board would be each county. That would be new ground and one we think is long overdue.
Congressman Lewis, I assume Senators Smith and Klobuchar are going to be in the governor's corner on this. How do you overcome that?
Again, I think the more publicity, quite frankly, we can get, Tom, the better, because I think we're on the right side of the issue. And if those senators up for re-election realize they're advocating a policy that most Minnesotans don't adhere to, and most of the country doesn't adhere to, I think that's going to be a really, really tough position to defend. So it's all about making certain we're aware of this, what's going on. That's why I introduced the amendment, to try to elevate it and give these guys a little backing. And if we do that, I think the senators will come around. I don't think they want to be on the wrong end of history here. This has been talked about for 25 years. What I can't figure out is why nobody did this before in Congress, to be honest with you. It's a pretty simple fix. Here's my amendment, right here. That's it. Because it just removes a grandfathered clause. So I don't think we're asking for anything that any other metropolitan area isn't already in conformity with. So I think that's going to be a tough position for the
Congressman,
opponents.
you know that most of the MPOs really do nothing but, or almost nothing but, distribute federal dollars. They were formed solely for that purpose. I came from Seattle. Puget Sound Council of Governments almost exclusively distributes this federal money. This thing is a lot bigger than that.
Right.
So is it, A, fair to make a comparison to things like Council of Governments? And
You're act-
secondly.
wait a minute,
how-
let me answer the
No,
question.
I get to ask two.
Well, no, I get to answer first, and then I'll answer the second question.
All right. Do you think I'm gonna remember?
With any kind of luck at all, you won't. You make the case of why, of all the MPOs, the Twin Cities should have elected representatives on its board. That's exactly the case we're making here. The other ones can't raise taxes independently. This Met Council can. This does far more than just transportation. It does housing, it does infrastructure, it does municipal lines, it does the whole ball of wax. So I would argue, as an answer to your question, that that's the absolute reason of all the Met Councils that should comply, it should be ours.
But that's different from the federal dollars question. The federal dollars question is certainly an interesting question, but the state legislature's empowered this thing to do all the things that you just referenced.
There was a famous Supreme Court decision many, many years ago that said that which the government subsidizes, it may regulate.
Okay.
And if you want $960 million for 14.5-mile light rail line, you're going to comply with the federal rules. And the federal rules for every other MPO are such that you have to have elected representatives on it.
And what would support,
Second question.
Hey, yeah. What would look different? You've got a tab, the tab distributes money, it's generally distributed by county
Oh, my
population.
goodness.
Wait, and there's not been a time that I can find that the Met Council didn't just ratify the tab. So what would look different under your system?
The comprehensive plan of probably every municipality. But again, I'm not here to say this comprehensive plan or Thrive 2040 is right or wrong. I'm here to give local autonomy back to the people who have to live under those rules. They can come up with exactly the same tab if they want.
Would you support direct election of council members like
That is
in
not in
Portland?
the amendment, and that is not in the current federal rules.
Okay. Would any of you support direct election?
No. If I could comment on the TAB issue, the TAB does not appropriate the money from the federal government. The TAB makes recommendations to the Met Council. The TAB is controlled by the Met Council, by its staff. The TAB is appointed much by Metro Cities, which is a pay-to-play organization. They have roughly half of the municipalities in the Met Council district that belong to Metro Cities. Well, if you don't belong to Metro Cities, the likelihood of getting appointed to that body to help decide where those federal dollars go is slim to none. They also control the development of policies in the background, whether it's through TAC, which is their technical advisory council to the TAB. So it's all cooked in the background before it ever gets to the surface at TAB. And that's what elected officials would avoid. If we make the Met Council the MPO and make them elected, or at least the majority of them elected, we are going to have a much more accountable system where everybody in the metro area will have the availability to get on that council, not just those that pay to be a part of an organization.
Okay, a question down that line, and maybe for the congressman or for the others. Okay, I understand that you folks want representation with taxation, okay, you're arguing that. You are anticipating, I would assume, some policy changes if that does indeed take place. In what areas? Light rail, regional planning, what things, issues clearly brought you here to this mantra of equal representation,
Right.
representation with taxation?
Well,
So therefore, what are the issues that you?
I would argue that self-government is an issue.
Well,
It's
I understand.
And that's
but
why
beyond that,
my
what are
amendment
the
just
kind of
simply
issues?
complies with federal law and leave the policy up to the people here. I would add one more thing on the Transportation Advisory Board, though. In 2015, the Federal Highway Administration, as well as the Federal Transit Administration, said this, quote, "The TAB is an advisory body to the council. The TAB is not designated as the MPO, and its membership is not consistent with federal law in that regard." So the notion that, well, the TAB's elected, doesn't even fly in the face of federal rule. Now, to your point on policy, as I said earlier, it's not my job as a federal office holder to make that sort of policy that would govern local communities on local specific things. There's some wider areas in transportation and infrastructure, things like that we'll do. But by and large, that's for these folks to do. That's all I'm trying to do is to jumpstart that process. What you may have, and by the way, let me reiterate this. It is my belief, if people say, well, you're trying to undercut the Met Council. Actually, if you have elected representatives on the Met Council, you strengthen the support for the council. It is now that you're getting people saying, well, I wouldn't do that, and the only reason they're doing it is because they're unelected. So again, I'm not trying to say this policy's right or this policy's wrong. I have my own views on that, but that's not the goal of my amendment. But I want to
Okay,
let
then
these
let's-
fellows respond to that.
If we could, yes. Let's do that.
Well, and with Senate File 2809, we're not trying to change the Met Council's role or any of the policies. What we're saying is that when you talk about the very issues that we've talked about, transportation, housing, Musaline, the things where we want to coordinate on a regional basis, who better to do that than our local elected officials, who have the boots on the ground, and quite honestly, who stand for election from their own constituents. And they're vying for these seats within their Met Council district, so they're convincing those that would come together. So I think this is a very inclusive process.
Well, let me ask you this, Senator Pratt,
Yeah.
because you're at the local policy level,
Yeah.
okay? Light rail has been brought up here a couple of times, Southwest Light Rail in the conversation. These elected officials behind you, is that a big concern as to how that's being pushed through, some will say? And would you anticipate that being different under a taxation with representation model that Representative Lewis Country Lewis is advocating?
I don't know if it would be different or not. Here's what I would hope. We heard from Minnesota businesses that were shut out of the bidding process. Different from what the Federal Transportation Administration had designated, even when our own MnDOT policies and procedures follows. Our Met Council kept 27 Minnesota businesses from bidding on the light rail project, and I think 22 of them were designated as DBEs. And so we heard that. We heard the Met Council wasn't being responsive to those needs. We heard from citizens of Calhoun Isle where the tunnel was going within feet of their building, and they had suffered construction damage from a previous project. And the Met Council wasn't responsive. We had to bring them in front of the legislature and have that hearing and make a formal recommendation to get that process moving. So the policy change, I hope, is that we have a Met Council that is responsive to the residents that it serves.
Senator, would you entertain a compromise that would allow the number of elected officials on this board represent the populations that are being represented? Like maybe we have.
It's hard to speculate on something like that. Right now, I'm supporting what we saw from the legislative auditor, which basically showed that every other MPO, regional governance. In fact, we have the Southwest Regional Development Co-op. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but down in Southwest Minnesota that does many of the same functions that our Met Council does, all with elected officials. And so we even have examples in this state where this model is working.
The legislative auditor's recommendation, though, was the so-called option 2, which was a mix of elected and appointed officials. Your bill, by my understanding, is not the appointed part at all. And so why is it not conforming with what that exact recommendation was, if that's what you're referencing?
Well, I recall the
I'm reading it here. I'm
Yeah,
just looking at it. So.
and I'm not gonna argue with it in front of you, but I do recall we had a lot of testimony around, the legislative auditor's report and the Council of Governments, and I thought we were pretty true to that. But it's something I'll take another look
Can I
at.
ask the sponsors, just to give us an idea where that legislation is? Will it be in the omnibus bill tomorrow maybe, or?
So the Senate is looking at potentially taking it up on Monday as a standalone bill.
House File 3273 was incorporated into the state government finance bill, and we're going to be taking it up as an omnibus bill tomorrow morning, or tomorrow afternoon on the floor.
Roz Peterson has a bill that would provide for staggered terms and change the nomination process, and she's a Republican. There's a Democrat sponsor in the Senate. Not a lot of sponsors in general. Do any of you have thoughts about that bill? Because, I don't know, maybe that would be some middle ground.
I don't know that it's really a middle ground per se, because what does staggered terms do? It just still does not recognize the need for elected officials to represent those that are being served by the Met Council. Staggered terms really doesn't go any further than to just say, you're still going to be serving a constituency in what? Oh, but by the way, you're just gonna have different people come and go from the board every so many years. So I think it's a nice tease or a nice, taste at the apple. But what we're really saying is we need fundamental change that really incorporates into the governance structure a means by which the people can be served, and the people that they send to the Met Council can be held accountable for the decisions that they take.
Can I ask for a show of hands, you up here, how many of you support the Southwest Light Rail line as it currently stands? We got two.
Great one.
And,
I could go off real fast, sir, before you ask your second thing. We're just gonna stand for 2 more questions after yours.
okay, I had another question was, can anybody here, just to get it clear, point to a time when the TAB has made a different recommendation than what the Met Council has made? Because I'm not aware of any.
I served on the TAB years ago, and basically, whatever the TAB came up with is what the council approved. And prior to that, the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, made recommendations to the TAB, and generally speaking, we accepted what they had first.
Let me get a show of hands. I got a question I want to ask the panel too here. How many of you were in favor of good governance reform of the Met Council before Southwest Light Rail? Good show of hands.
If I could just make one last comment. I still remember when Senator Pratt came to me and asked me if I wanted to sign on to the bill. And he had no axe to grind. Our conversation never addressed light rail, and he said, Scott, this is going to help the Met Council be more effective. They're gonna have more confidence, there's gonna be more transparency. I don't think that I would have signed on to it if it had been some sort of single issue or an axe to grind. I just remember Senator Pratt being very committed. This will make for better government. So that was why I was going to.
So given that everyone up here has supported the reforms that you're talking about, Congressman, I know what you're talking about federal meddling, but isn't it the job of these folks here in the state legislature to do this? What makes you come in here and say, we're gonna do this from the federal level?
Because in 1991, the role of a federal MPO changed dramatically, and it gave them more powers, although in many areas, not as much power as the Met Council has. And at that point, along with federal money, by granting, remember this was created, I think, in 1962, these regional planning authorities. That was a federally created enterprise with more power and with federal money coming. There are certain precepts that the federal government says if you want to be a federally designated MPO, you have to abide by. And I think most people think that.
Commissioner Beard,
Yeah.
since you've got all this expertise with transportation finance, just wanted to ask you, last summer, the Center for the American Experiment flooded the airways with advertising that carried the narrative that the Met Council was taking money that could go to regional highways and spending it on transit instead. We always thought those were two pots of money. What do you, any response?
There, to the extent that general fund money is discretionary, John, that is true. The constitutionally dedicated money can only be spent at the state level, state money that's raised here, gas tax, registration fees, license fees, sales tax, has to be spent through the highway fund. Except for some of the sales tax on motor registration fee, motor vehicle sales tax, no more than 60% can be on highways, no less than 40 for transit. There's a great deal of general fund money, though, that also subsidizes transit operations of the Metropolitan Council. When I left, I think it was up to about $550 million for the biennium. I think it's probably over 800 or 900 million per biennium now that subsidizes all phases. The opt-out money comes from the motor vehicle sales tax, MVEST we call it. There's a very, very small portion that goes to the suburban counties for running their own transit system. However, that money could be deflected. The other general fund money could be going to highway congestion relief and things like that. But no, we put it in, actually we call transit a congestion relief tool. I contend it is not, but we do put that money there. So to that extent, yes, there is truth to that assertion.
If you get this resolved at the end of the session and signed by the governor, is that likely to make the Met Council go away as a state issue in the fall campaign?
As an issue for the campaign?
For the fall campaign?
Probably. Now, I want to be clear though, because Bob touched on something I reacted to with a knee jerk. Some of my friends who are running for statewide office say we have to eliminate the Met Council. That is absolutely not what we're contending for. We think that a regional planning and coordinating agency is very important to good governance in the Twin Cities. We're after reforming the governance model, and it will be a reform, not a restructure or complete wholesale redo. So thank you for the question, Bob.
Thank you so much for attending, everyone. If you have any questions, follow up real fast. I'll be over in the corner. Feed me again. I'm Carter Moulton from Jason Lewis's office. Thank you.
One city, but it's thinking about the whole entire region. We've got a workforce shortage right now. As of just a couple weeks ago, we had about 100,000 job vacancies in the Twin Cities region. You know, if we don't make sure that we're accessing every single bit of talent that we have on the table as a region, we stand to lose about $31 billion by 2040. $31 billion. Any good business person would say that that is absolutely unacceptable. And so, you know, every one of these individual electeds, every one of these cities, every one of these mayors, they are charged, not specifically with looking out for the region, they are charged with looking out for their city. And right now we need a much broader vision than that. And so, I'll say a few additional things. First, you know, let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about proportional representation. I heard a whole lot about accountability, about transportation, about proportional representation from the previous speakers. You know, if they really wanted accountability and proportional representation, then they would be arguing for a Met Council that has members designated proportional to the population. Interestingly, they're not doing that. If they really wanted accountability and direct representation, then they would be arguing for direct representation where Met Council members are elected directly. Interestingly, once again, they're not doing that. Why? Let's just call it out. Because every single one of them is opposed to public transportation and light rail. That's what this is about at the end of the day. So rather than kind of fake it and pretend like this is about good governance when it absolutely is not, we saw it. They were against direct representation. They were against proportional representation, and every single one of them was against light rail, across the board. That's transparency. So next, let's talk about why we need to continue the Met Council. Let's talk about why we need to have an overarching body that is looking out not just for one particular city, but for the entire region. You know, we're looking to the FDA to fund Southwest Light Rail, the Botno line and the Orange line, bus rapid transit line that runs down 35W to the suburbs. The Met Council has shepherded these vital regional projects for years. We've been in good hands and don't see a reason to change course right now at this critical juncture. We're so close to getting the funding necessary to get these projects done. Stability. Stability is also important in the Met Council's success, and we need people on the council that look to regional interests and the success of many constituencies instead solely and exclusively one city or one county or one portion of a county at a time. I'll also note that this bill entirely circumvents local people power decision making. If we want to change the makeup of the Met Council, well then let's do it right. Let's do it by the law. Get input from the people, go through the legal process that we already have in place. If people support a change, which my office, by the way, has heard like nothing about, it needs the support of 75% of the cities on the Met Council to agree to such a change. 75%. And what I think they're correct about is they know that a change would circumvent the vast majority of the population, and specifically larger cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul. So let's talk about what this is really about. Let's be honest, let's be transparent, and let's let good government continue to be good government. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to have Mayor Jake Spano.
Thank you, Mayor Frey. Jake Spano, Mayor in St. Louis Park. That was an interesting 15 minutes, right? A lot of talk about how this isn't about the Met Council, but this is absolutely about the Met Council. And as Mayor Frey said, this is absolutely about transit. You know, there's an adage that doctors frequently, or you hear sort of thrown around that, you know, in order to save the patient, we had to kill the patient. And we all understand the sort of counterintuitive nature of a statement like that. Are there opportunities to make change? Of course there are opportunities to make change. But think for 1 second about the model that they're talking about, where those who would authorize money would also appropriate money. Congress has different policy bodies that authorize spending and different bodies that appropriate spending. Why? Because it's a conflict of interest if the people who are making decisions about where the money is going are the same people that are allocating the money. And I think that that is a huge mistake, to have the folks that are in charge of making the policy decisions about the priorities of Met Council also be the ones that are appropriated. That's why you have TAB, which appropriates money with authorization, obviously, from the Met Council. And I also just wanted to point out something that I heard that I think Congressman Lewis said that the Met Council's not in compliance, and he mentioned a couple of letters. I think all of you have in your packet a February 1, 2016 letter from DOT that explicitly states in the first paragraph that they are in compliance. So I think making sure that we have our information straight is important. And this is a problem in search of a solution. I think you heard sort of almost uniformly across the board up here, people say they had no problem with the decisions Met Council was making, they had no problems with the decision, or the people who were represented doing the job on Met Council. So I suppose if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and you want to try and fix that. And I'll just close by saying, Congressman Lewis stood up here and said that Southwest Light Rail was going to get $916 million, and I plan on holding him to that. I'm glad to hear that he's supportive of our project. My wife also tells me I'm not funny, but it sure doesn't stop me from trying. Thank you.
I'm Jim Hovland. I'm the, as I mentioned earlier, the chair of the TAB. I've been on the TAB for, I think, over a decade now. My 14th year as mayor, and I've been the chair about the last 3 years. So if you'd asked me when I first got on the TAB years ago, did I think this model was a good one, I wouldn't have known what to think. But I can tell you that over time, I've come to really appreciate this nuanced model that we have. So I think we ought to actually be celebrating and not denigrating the model that we've got, because it is so special compared to what exists around the country. When they talk about an MPO earlier, you got to think about, well, what is the definition of an MPO? And this gentleman that's sitting out here that lived in Seattle had it right. An MPO is a federally mandated, federally funded, transportation-related organization. So everywhere else in the country, you've got folks involved in a COG, a Council of Governments, for an MPO that are dealing with transportation issues exclusively. Think of the breadth and the depth of the work that's being done here by this Met Council. In the mid-70s, Governor Levander said, the troubles that we're having in the region are too big for a single city alone to deal with. Wastewater management, stormwater management, economic development strategies, transit run by a private provider that was failing the public. This entity was created to serve all of us. And the work that they do is astounding. People that I interact with on the TAB that are on the Met Council as members, they're working 20 to 30 hours a week. So first of all, think of the practical implications of trying to have elected officials. And incidentally, I think there's 29 in number that are proposed, almost half the size of the state Senate, to run this new organization. 20 to 30 hours a week. You tell me where a county commissioner that's supposed to have a full-time job, or people like me that already have 2 full-time jobs, are supposed to be able to come and serve in the capacity these existing Met Council members are serving them, the way they actually serve the public. Secondly, I'm not so sure that what's proposed isn't borderline illegal from the research that I've done. You can't have, and Mayor Spano alluded to it, you can't have the regulated being the regulators. It's just impossible. You can't serve 2 masters. And there's plenty of case law in Minnesota on that. That's why judges can't be elected officials. That's why there's a case that says that the chief of police in St. Paul couldn't be in the legislature. It's just too difficult a situation to get involved in. So between the practicality of it, the fact that we have a different kind of MPO that has a significant amount of work that could never be effectively done by elected officials, I think that we ought to be thinking hard. Plus the conflict of interest, apparent conflict of interest. I think we ought to be looking at the existing model and embracing it and celebrating what we've got. That's different than anybody else has in the country. There's some exquisite elegance to what was done by our legislature in the mid-70s, and we ought to appreciate it and embrace it.
Are each of you going to talk, or can we?
I just wanted to say that I was on the nominating committee the last 2 times, and the process is transparent. And to my knowledge, nobody has taken the time to even ask me about what it was like. The other thing is they said 40-some cities have signed on to this. That's a small part of the total number of cities that are in the Metropolitan Council. And the other thing is that I think it's unwarranted. I think this is a system that works, and we're spending too much time on it and money.
Good afternoon, Dan Ryan,
Brooklyn Center council member. I really appreciate the comments of the mayors who preceded me here. Well, as a council member, one of the first things we have to learn before voting on any proposal is, does it entail a conflict of interest? And I believe in this case, this most certainly does. This alleged reform would call upon local elected officials to serve on the council. And why is it that this is being brought forward? I really feel it's because a few local elected officials, a few county representatives don't like the outcomes. If people don't like the outcomes from the Met Council, they'll go after the process. And it was quoted earlier that 40 members approve of this so-called reform. Cities? Cities. But what about the other cities, the other 180 cities who do not? You should ask them about that. And what will happen should this go forward? It would create tremendous delay. We've already seen that over many years, many delays on many projects in transportation have harmed the metro area. We face daunting regional problems, and the Met Council has been a model of integrity, transparency, and accountability. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Gary Hansen, Eagan City Council and Metro City's president. Just want to wrap up, probably one of the benefits or drawbacks, whatever, being last is that everything you had in your mind has already been said. I don't want to repeat that, but I just wanted to reaffirm that Metro Cities has 90 members, and we represent the common interest of those 90 members before the Metropolitan Council and the Governor's Office and the Legislature. And the great majority of those members are opposed to having local elected officials on the Metropolitan Council for the reasons that have already been explained. And so I want to thank the mayors and Councilmember Ryan for everything that you have said, excellent points, and we will open it up for questions.
How about the idea that these people, these Met Council members, just answer to one person and effectively are a policy arm of the governor rather than representing the communities, which is the charge that we made?
Can you ask the question again?
The idea that these people answer to one person, to the governor, rather than to the local community.
There's two ways of doing this. You either have an elected position, and hopefully if it was an elected, it would be done so either proportionally or through direct representation, which would be the truly transparent way of doing it, or you have an appointed position, and appointed positions have to be appointed by somebody. So, you know, they're your choices at the end of the day, but what the Republicans have tried to go after is like this third option that is not elected by the people, that is not transparent, that is not proportional at all. In fact, it's like the exact opposite, and that's what they're going for. And all we're saying is, look, we want a body that is looking out for the regional interests, not one municipality, not the 40 cities out of 100 and a couple hundred that are supporting this. You need someone that's looking out for the region as a whole.
Mayor
So
Frey?
you're arguing about proportional representation, okay, that you want to see this. Your opponents in this particular issue will say that Central City, Minneapolis, and St. Paul, and some of the other communities are using this arrangement of Metropolitan Council to exercise power to get light rail and other funds, okay, whether it be federal or state or Met Council taxes or whatever, that they're using that to concentrate the effects of that in Central City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and some of the bigger communities. And what the reason, if I understand them correctly, is that they want to do that differently so they got more influence in the process.
Right.
What, do you agree with them, or is that wrong, or is that not, or is that right?
I agree with a lot of your analysis, which is that the main reason that they're trying to do this is to get rid of light rail and public transportation forms. But the second thing that they know correctly is that public transportation is really popular. People want it. And that's why they're trying to finagle this weird system of doing it. And by the way, this totally bypasses the system that we already have in place. The system that we already have in place requires 75% of the populations in the surrounding city to support a change. They know that the existing rule won't allow them to make that change because, once again, people are in favor generally of public transportation.
Mayor Hovland, can you say,
You want me to just chime in on this issue first? You want me to?
no, but sure.
No. Okay. Well, I was just handing some
some data that I sort of instinctually knew from being on the tab, is that the funding kind of tracks the populations of the counties. So if anybody wants this, you can get it from the folks that are involved here. And the last thing that we do at the tab, after we've gone through this objective scoring system that gets set up every 2 years, is we look at it for regional balance. And so we've got 34 people, 18 of them are elected officials. And we've made some wonderful decisions together. In fact, the first time we used this methodology a couple of years ago, the whole tab got up and applauded when we were finished, because we did everything on an objective basis, and then for a final cut through it, we looked at the geographic balance and looked at it over time. Now, it might vary from solicitation period to solicitation period, which is on a 2-year cycle, but over time, everything tends to get balanced out. So go ahead.
So you're an attorney and you're the head of the tab, so I'm gonna ask you a legal question here. If Lewis's amendment went forward and the MPO, the Met Council could not be the MPO without some major reform, I mean, as Peter was saying, the Met Council is a lot more than just be an MPO, it does all these other things. I mean, is there a future where you could have 2 organizations? Is that one outcome where it would separate, or do you see this as like, it would undermine the Met Council as an entire body? I mean, can you read into that a little bit?
From my understanding is that there would have to be, there we go.
Well, that's probably an indicator that this needs to be the last question. So if you want to grab people one-on-one.
My understanding is that there would have to be some kind of a vote amongst the government, amongst the cities. There we go.
So who's running this?
Even though being a lawyer, I don't know what the exact legal requirements would be on making a conversion to a different kind of MPO.
Well, can you go behind the mic more?
Sure.
Since I've been accused of being from Seattle, I'll talk to that. I thought this model was kind of odd when I got here. And I wonder if you guys, you know, a Republican could win the next election. He or she could win by 200 votes. And then he or she could put 17 Republicans, many of whom maybe oppose light rail, on the Metropolitan Council. Is that representative? Is that proportional? Is that fair? Would you be okay with that?
Well, I think it's a good question. It was asked in a little bit different way earlier. And I've been through 2 cycles now, once with Governor Plenty and once with Governor Dayton. I would say that the best Metropolitan Council I've seen has been under Governor Dayton. And that was because they had freedom to do the work that they needed to do on behalf of the region. I think Governor Plenty was a little bit more managerial in his style, especially with respect to transit and his desires on transit. So that is an infirmity, or potential infirmity in this system that we've got. But on balance, I think the legislature thought that through in the mid-70s and decided that on balance, this was a better way to do it than having purely elected officials, you know, as I said earlier, serving 2 masters, or having the regulated be the regulators too.
Okay, thank you very much.